All right, so to our key speaker tonight is Shelby Bessette, class of 2018. A lot of us got to work with Shelby, got a lot to volunteer with her when she was out at the Coastal Studies Lab. She's an avid hunter, avid outdoors person. The bottom right-hand picture, unfortunately, we did not get a picture of the actual event, but she was helping out at fish trails. For those of us that were out there, we remember her jumping up, grabbing a limb from a tree and knocking the whole tree down. It was really, really cool. It's like her superpower. Here I was with a chainsaw. All it took is Shelby grabbing a limb and she knocked the whole thing down. It was really cool. We were sad to see her leave the valley, but we were very happy that she stayed in touch. Some of the work that she does now, she's sort of seen a connection with what we have down here. And so she has graciously volunteered to share with us a little bit about Quail Forever. And so Shelby, I will be passing this over to you.
All right, great. Thanks for the introduction, Robert. And is everyone hearing me okay so far?
Yes, you're coming in good.
Yes, okay, on your end. All right. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Shelby Bessette. I'm currently in South Carolina, but the nonprofit I work for is a national organization. They're called Pheasants Forever, and Quail Forever is a division within that. So some of this will be tied to South Carolina, and some of it's going to be tied to Texas. And we'll just make those connections there because much of what I do has to do with the Farm Bill. So it's federal funds that are used all around the country. And I'm what's called a Farm Bill private lands biologist. Let's see, I'm trying to go next. There we go. All right, so Pheasants and Quail Forever, they're a 501c3 nonprofit, and they established in 1982. Quail Forever was not created until 2005 as a division under Pheasants Forever. For those of you that might be familiar with the background in that, I get a lot of folks asking me what happened to Quail Unlimited. If you ever hear that, Quail Unlimited was not associated with this organization. They were separate and they dissolved sometime in the early 2000s. And that's one of the reasons Pheasants Forever took the initiative to coin the term Quail Forever, and they actually bought out that brand so that it could not be taken by another organization. They've been termed the habitat organization because most of what we do is trying to implement habitat on the ground. And with Farm Bill funds, we do that a lot with private landowners. So they're the largest nonprofit dedicated to upland habitat conservation. They've spent over 500 million on over about 500,000 projects in 12 million acres. Right now, we've got about 175 biologists throughout the country, and that's within level of what you may see with like U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So there's a lot of us. The mission statement is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. So chapters, we've got our nonprofit and we have our chapters, just like in Master Naturalists, we have our Rio Grande Valley chapter. It's a very similar concept. So if folks in an area where there is not a chapter yet, in South Texas, it's very sparse. I'll show some maps coming up soon. But if a group of people wanted to create a chapter, they could. And I actually partook in that process in North Carolina. I live very close to the South Carolina and North Carolina border right now. And I joined a chapter called Women on the Wing of North Carolina. And I did that with just 2 other women. So one of them is the treasurer, one of them is the president, and I am just a board member. They might call me vice president sometimes, but it really doesn't take much to get something like that started. It is very grassroots, start small. We did a couple hunting activities. We did a virtual lesson and things like that. So it's been really fun, and just trying to get other women involved and talk to them about these great things going on in the organization. So right now there are 750 local chapters across the country. So that's a lot. We're covering over 44 states and 140,000 members. So chapters, they are able to actually use 100% of their funds raised. So if a chapter has a banquet or a silent auction or whatever they're doing to raise money, they can then determine how they want to spend it. That's very different than what you might see in like a Ducks Unlimited organization. A lot of times you don't know where that money is going. But that's one of the things that Pheasants and Quail Forever take pride in, is that their chapters get to decide how the money is spent. So they may be creating pollinator plots, they may be hosting youth events. It's up to their members to determine how they want to use those funds. Some of that, again, with hunting heritage, we've had over 300,000 youth in the outdoors through different local chapter events, and they're reaching more than 50,000 youth nationwide annually. The women-led groups, those are growing and getting more attention now, and we're really just trying to get other women into the outdoors, enjoying habitats. We're linking landowners, farmers, ranchers, anyone in between. So this is a lot of business talk. No one really thinks sometimes about how much business is behind nonprofits, but it's a can be complicated world, and there's a lot of folks doing great stuff. And so, we're not the only ones. Pheasants Quail Forever are not the only ones. I've got a list there on the right side of some other organizations that do similar work for upland habitat. So one of the big ones there in Texas is the Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute. And what's going on now is a lot of organizations that do habitat work, they're getting into these federal farm bill funds. And those are dispersed usually through USDA centers. And so what the nonprofit world is finding, and same thing with government, is using the nonprofit experts. They're able to really reach landowners better and able to bridge that gap to where the landowners are actually being able to use these funds. They're getting in to the USDA offices and getting habitat recommendations from the biologists and able to get funding to help do work on their land. And so that's really the big push behind this. And a lot of folks are getting on board, which is great. And if you think about it, private lands, especially in Texas, 97% of Texas is privately owned. Well, if we're trying to conserve the land, we really have to work with private landowners, because the other stuff, the state parks, the federal refuges, and those sort of things, that's a very small percent. And those folks already have budgets and biologists and other experts that work for them. And so this is where we're trying to help the private landowner and improve and conserve habitats that way. Robert had mentioned to me a week ago or so about Quail Associates 2.0. So I wanted to just point this out because, with in nonprofit worlds, there's all kinds of ways of giving. And I was a little confused too. I was like, what is that? Is that another app? Because I'll get to it, but there's a whole Bobscapes app coming. And so I was researching it, thinking, where is this leading me? And it actually led me to their annual giving. So it was a special initiative, basically getting those folks that are very enthusiastic about quail, and they're going to get linked to some of the forecasting and different studies that are going on behind it. So if you really love quail and you want to know how they're doing in Texas, there's a annual giving Associates 2.0 for the Cesar Claiborne Institute. All right, let me switch to the next one. There we go. All right, so the bobwhite quail, that's the one that I mainly focus on. They are the species identified of greatest need in my state that I'm currently in, South Carolina, but also Texas and a lot of the southeast there. Much of their problems have been because of habitat changes over, the last centuries. Agriculture, forestry, urbanization, you name it, people are changing it, right? We're taking habitat and we're developing areas. The forestry practices that go on here in the southeast, everyone's growing trees as fast and as dense as possible. And that's great if you're trying to make money on timber, but it's not great for upland habitat. And so those are kind of the areas where our biologists are able to bridge the gap and help landowners create a balance on their landscape. In Texas, there's actually several species of quail. We've got 4 different species: the northern bobwhite, the scaled quail, the Gambel's quail, and the Montezuma. They're in all regions of the state, but what you'll mostly see in the coastal plains of South Texas will be your bobwhite quail. And I've actually heard bobwhite quail. One of the last times I was down there leading a youth hunt at Laguna Atascosa. If you've ever been up on the Bayside Loop, there's a tower and you can look over that area. And I was standing on that tower and heard quail calling. And I was just so surprised that they were calling right next to me, 30 feet from salt water. I did not realize that they would move that close into a salty environment. So that was very cool to see. And the graph here showing on the bottom left, showing some numbers. The median for surveys right now in South Texas, they're just under 10 quail. But compared to the rest of Texas, South Texas has lots of quail. In other areas, rainfall really impacts them heavily, and if they don't get that rain, then they won't have quail. And so the goal is to, reach some of the historic numbers. You can see in 2015, their surveys, they were getting 25 quail seen per survey. So even though South Texas is doing fairly well compared to the rest of the other state, they still have lots of room to improve. And of course, I didn't put a quail song on here. I should have, but the name bobwhite is kind of how it gets its name from the call that the males make. So here's some pictures of habitat. Things that we're looking to bring into an environment, into a landscape, is we're looking for areas where the quail can nest, brood, feed, loaf, travel, rest, and roost. So they have a lot of different requirements there, and they're going to need that based on what's happening in their life cycle. And so the kind of take homes is you want to have some native seed sources. You want to have plants that are bringing in insects because they're going to be eating a lot of those bugs. So if I'm going through a brood rearing habitat, a lot of times I like to see bugs jumping up from my footsteps. That can tell me that this is a good productive area and would bring good food for any quail broods. I've listed a few plants here that you could plant, like ragweed is a good one, sunflowers. Ragweed, a lot of people don't like for their allergies, but quail really love it. And also some fruit-bearing trees like wild plums. So they do like some soft mass fruits. Okay. So for their life cycle, they're a very short-lived bird. Most birds don't, they're lucky to live past a year old. The joke is that quail are very good at reproducing, but also even better at dying. So they are very fragile. And you've got, let's see, the way their cycle works with nesting is through March through October is generally their nesting season. They can nest multiple times, especially if something happens to their nest, then a female would like to re-nest. So in the fall, they covey up, and that's where they get together in about a dozen up to maybe 30 birds in a covey, and they will hang out in their covey throughout the winter, and come spring they start breaking up and they build their pair bonds. And so in the spring we do what's called whistle counts, and that's where the males are making their bob white call, and we will listen out to get population estimates then. And then throughout the spring into later summer, they're going to nest, brood. They'll re-nest if they need to, if something goes wrong. Like here in South Carolina, we have tons of rain. So if their nest got rained out, then they might want to re-nest. In the fall, they get ready to shuffle around back into their coveys. Some other things to consider with their population is immigration and emigration. So immigration is birds coming in, emigration is birds coming out. So if a bird is leaving a covey or leaving an area, then they're emigrating out. And then of course you have other predator related deaths. Of course we've got a lot of falcons and different predatory birds in South Texas that would love to eat a baby quail. They're very small birds. They can be about 6 to 12 inches, only 5 to 10 ounces. They eat insects, grains, weed seeds, berries. They like early successional habitat. Their incubation period is about a month long, 25 days-ish. First hatch, it can vary depending on what state you're in and also the region of that state. But you're looking around May or June that they're going to start having their eggs. They'll lay about 7 to 28 eggs depending on the quail species. And the next nest success is we're averaging around 50%. So very, very tough on those birds. Some of their predators, for the nest at least, is raccoon, possums, snakes, and skunks. And as adult birds, their predators are humans, predatory birds like hawks, foxes, and owls. And this is a picture in the middle of a nest. And so you can see they've nested in some grass there, and it's all covered up and hidden. This is just a graph showing some of the nest predators and the percentages that they predate, because one of the biggest things when I contact or talk with landowners, you know, the first things they're going to say is, what about predator management? Do I need to kill every coyote I have? And that's just a myth. Really, the coyotes are having a small impact on those quail. And quail have been dealing with coyotes their entire evolution. So as long as there's a balance and there's no reason that those coyotes are coming into an area as a sink, then we don't really recommend predator management. We recommend improving habitat and creating cover so that quail have a place to escape from these natural predators. So if you want to share that with anyone in the future, I'm even as a hunter, I'm one of the odd hunters. I don't really go for predator hunting, and this is, you know, one of the reasons why is it's just a myth that coyotes are killing all these animals. So coyotes are a very small percent, and I would say if you want to get rid of an animal that's probably on your property, or try to at least cut them back a little, it would be raccoons. Raccoons, they love quail eggs, they love quail chicks. They can get into anything, and the trapping methods with them these days are pretty interesting. They're basically like a handcuff. So a raccoon may try to grab a treat in a trap, and they'll just be handcuffed. So that's pretty humane way of trapping those animals and relocating them if you need to get lots of raccoons off your property. One of the more challenging thoughts dealing with landowners who like to hunt, especially in Texas and also same in my state, is a lot of areas allow feeding corn to deer, baiting for hunting, right? So the problem with that is that it's not just the deer eating that corn, and that's where you may increase a predator sink, because raccoons are going to come in there and they're also going to eat that corn. A lot of your hunters, they may have game cameras, and they probably have a story of raccoons climbing up onto their deer feeders to eat all the corn. So it's interesting kind of way to look at it, as raccoons are really probably the bigger predator of that species. This picture here on the right is a mother with her quail chicks, protecting them from either heat or a predator, but they will do that as a way of protection and brood rearing. Chick mortality, it's mostly a lot of snake mortality, some mammal, some avian predators. But these are very small chicks. You can see compared to the fingertips of this person's hand, they're about the size of your thumb. And so one of the important things is these chicks need to be able to move around, and that's where we'll get into some of that early successional habitat, prescribed burning, things like that. That gives enough bare ground for the chick to run around. I have a quick video. I'm going to see if I can pull it up. I'm actually going to stop sharing for just a second. So I have to make sure I shared this correctly. Oh, that's my video. Okay. Here we go. Share. Here we go. Okay, so this is just a quick habitat tip for our quail.
You know, when we talk about great wildlife habitat and diversity, we're talking about a mixture of grasses and forbs, wildflowers, broadleaf plants, all that kinds of thing, in a great balance, a balance of both of them. And what we get out of that is bare ground that's so important for pollinator habitat and pheasant quail habitat. A great wildlife habitat planting that has a balance of grasses and forbs in there is going to naturally have areas of bare ground like this. That's critically important to pheasant and quail chicks that are looking for an area to feed on insects, need to move around, escape predators, that sort of thing, and nesting habitat for native pollinators like native bees. Bare habitat like this is one of the first things that we lose in habitat. Natural succession moves us into something that's more dominated by grasses. That's the time that we need to put some management back on the ground so we can have a balance of grasses, forbs, and bare ground.
All right, so that was a bit of what I was mentioning with having the bare ground underneath like a cover of grasses. Okay. A bit about the federal farm bill. I'm going to switch gears. Hope I don't bounce around too much for you all. The federal farm bill is actually implemented from the Food Security Act. which was established in 1985. So it's kind of different than I would have expected. This was all, new to me when I took this job a year ago. That, we're working to help farmers, get food for us Americans. So they're big into looking into agricultural, economic growth, managing hunger, anything like that. So making sure we have resilient communities, and the way we do that is by supporting our farmers and ranchers. This year, every 5 years, the Farm Bill gets re-implemented. So the last time it was done in 2018. Likely they're just going to replicate what was done in 2018, but basically every 5 years there's an ability to make changes in the Farm Bill, shift funding around however needed. And those are, a bill is signed by the president, so it goes through the whole legislative process to get passed through. So a lot goes into it, everything from farming with dairy, wool, wheat, grains, cotton, all the way to, providing food stamps for folks is all through this Food Security Act. Okay. So most of the funds you can see here go to nutrition. So that's that big piece of the pie chart. So that's going to be your nutrition assistance programs. The next piece of the pie is your crop insurance. So farmers and ranchers can also go into these USDA centers and sign up for crop insurance. And that's very helpful to those folks because, even if you just garden, it's a risk of planting something. You never know what's going to come up or something might impact it. Commodities and conservation. So conservation is this piece here, 7%. And that's where all the Farm Bill programs come out of. And so in total, it's about $428 billion are funded through this. And sometimes more. Like recently, there was an Inflation Reduction Act that went through, and then all of a sudden there was more monies for the programs, and more projects were able to get passed through. So much of this job is paying attention to what's happening on the government side to make sure that what funding is available to your landowners. And so most of the programs deal with these type of land uses: agricultural lands, wetlands, and forest lands. And there's the various programs underneath them. Basically, there's a lot of options for folks if they need to try to get some funding for habitat. A few of the programs that we highlight, the Conservation Reserve Program. This is usually to retire crop or pasture lands and to improve soil and water and air. And those are usually longer contracts, about 5 to 10 years. The next one is a very short contract. This is where we start folks out as, if they have not been part of these programs. We usually go with what's called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And the way I like to explain it is if you have a lot of work to do, this is the best program for you versus the first one I mentioned, CRP, and the one under it, CSP. Those are more designed for folks that already have habitat in place and maybe just need to create a few enhancements. So that the Conservation Stewardship Program maintains, improves, and expands conservation practices. So that's usually someone who's already doing pretty good as a steward, and we're going to increase their stewardship ability by sending them through that program. There's a couple others there. The one at the bottom, the Voluntary Public Access Habitat Incentives Program. That is actually for state governments or tribal lands to apply for the money, and then they can then disperse it through their state agencies. So there's multiple levels of these federal funds working their ways down the channels. And one of the big initiatives is called Working Lands for Wildlife. There's a website just for this. And this is a good landowner tool, a place where landowners can share things going on. Biologists and other resource professionals can share things that they have going. There's a data share portal for it. Very good website here. And whenever a project is termed Working Lands for Wildlife within those farm bill funds, usually that puts them a little point extra. So these farm bill funds are not guaranteed to any one landowner. They actually go into a whole pool that the state looks at. And, you know, most people get funded, but some don't. So it just depends on what the projects are and how the needs fit, and they get go through a ranking process, and that's how they determine who is funded and who is not. And so if you are doing a project that's doing Working Lands for Wildlife, a lot of times those projects rank pretty high because you're working with a species of greatest concern like our bobbright quail. Private lands biologist, I mentioned, you know, that's what I do, but there's not just me, and there's not just Quail Forever biologists. We work hand in hand with state agencies. You might hear them called private lands biologists, wildlife biologists. The terms kind of go interchangeably, or a partner biologist. I've heard that one as well. But basically, we support voluntary incentive-based programs built around agricultural resilience, private land stewardship to sustain rural communities. We emphasize conservation practices that address multiple resource concerns to improve habitat, soil health, and water quality. So this is just ensuring that all farmers, ranchers, and landowners have access to conservation programs to be effective. When we go out with a landowner, we go through a planning process. So we discuss what the objectives are for that landowner. You know, for my case, I go into a lot of timber forests. If that landowner, their main goal is to get revenue from their timber, then I have to respect that. You know, I can't tell this person, go cut half your trees down because you need to grow more quail. I just find other ways to hopefully implement some habitat on their land. So it may just be like what's called daylighting a road, where we may just take out a small portion of the trees right near a road to create a weedy barrier so that it just doesn't go from forest to road to forest, so that there's a little transition and a corridor for these early successional species. We examine natural resource concerns. So we look at any erosion problems, any other, you know, health concerns of the area, if there's pollution, things like that. Point out areas for protection, restoration, and improvement. Like I mentioned, we're going to start making recommendations of these areas that they could make some changes and that might not affect their overarching goals too much. We discuss their economic goals for the farm and the operations so that we make sure that, you know, we don't affect their livelihood. We want to enhance their property and help them out. We don't want to, you know, make them go broke from making a bad decision. And we review the recommendations for conservation systems and individual practices and then weigh their alternatives. So a lot of times it's mostly recommending things and waiting on that landowner to feel comfortable to start implementing them. So it does take a lot of kind of education and trust for some of these folks to really start creating some habitat on their land. Most of our land use types are going to be one of these three: forest lands, agricultural lands, or hay or pasture. And so in South Texas, we mostly have that hay and pasture and agricultural lands, not so much forest lands unless you're getting into Northeast Texas. These are what's called practices. So if you ever do go into a USDA center, the NRCS department is part of that, and that is who runs these farm bill applications. And so when we're recommending things, a lot of times these on the list come first. So for agricultural practices, they will get extra funding for going to no-till. If they do a conservation crop rotation where they're improving the soil based on what plants they're growing each year, and cover crops. So in the winter, maybe when they're not growing anything, instead of leaving the soil barren, planting a cover crop helps maintain that soil, helps reduce any erosion problems, and so forth. For plantings, the wildlife habitat planting, that's known as our pollinator plots. Within those pollinator plots, there's various requirements. So it's a minimum of 12 species, and 4 of each have to bloom in each season. So it really creates a diverse planting as well thought out. And the benefit to working with a biologist like myself or another partner biologist is we're helping those landowners make sure they're getting native plants in the ground. There's just so much stuff online where someone might think they're getting a good mix, and there's different non-natives mixed in there. So we will actually come up with custom mixes. There's various calculators we've created based on soil types and things to help a landowner get the seeds that they need. Field borders or filter strips. So a field border would go around the field. I have an image of that coming. Same thing with filter strips. That's going to be on the edge of a waterway, basically leaving it natural, letting it get weedy, not mowing it or not planting it in agricultural crops. Tree and shrub establishment. So, for instance, if a forest is all pines and there's no fruit producing trees, we may do a shrub planting recommendation to get some other diversity of native fruit bearing trees to improve for wildlife benefit. And the last one I mentioned there is prescribed burning, which is a fear of a lot of folks. But again, the same thing with working with biologists, getting to know other folks. We do a lot of landowner outreach events where landowners work with other landowners and do some prescribed burning work to help each other out, and also kind of bridge that gap of those fears of prescribed burning. So where have we been and where are we going, and kind of how has that impacted our habitats? Well, back in the day, I don't know what day that was, but a long time ago, quail were everywhere. And so a lot of your older generations, they have stories of hearing quail, and they knew that they call them ditch birds because they would grow in the weedy ditches. Well, one of the big things that changed was agricultural mechanisms. And now with these industrial agriculture fields and equipment, they are farming from edge to edge, and there's no field border, there's no weedy material for these early successional species to survive. So that's kind of what this looks like. You see this field's been planted all the way up until the forest edge. So that just really gives no place for quail to live, and they're not going to be very successful trying to cross that field wide open. Same thing with these, looks like hay lands on the right side. It just goes from grass to strips of trees or pockets of forest. So there's very little variability in there. So some of the improvements a landowner can make for a crop landowner, they can leave standing grain. So a lot of times we say, don't cut straight edges, maybe come out and make a curve and leave a few strips of soybeans or whatever it may be they have on their land. And and quail will actually feed on corn and soybeans. And so that's one of the things that will bring them food benefits. There's also practices of crop rotating, fallow fields, and cover crops. That's what this kind of looks like here. So they've done no-till here, and then they also had a rotation of at least from cover crop to their spring crop. And one of the points on working your agricultural field to the edge, especially if there is a forested edge, well, that forested edge is not getting as much sunlight. And so what we're able to do is show a landowner, like, you know, you're not going to lose that much revenue on your corn production by taking out 15 feet of the edge. Because if you look at the picture on the right, you can see how the reduced sunlight affected the way those corn grew. And so if they see that the loss is very minimal, then they might be more willing to create that field border, which is pictured there on the left. So you've got your agricultural plants and then a bit of a field border up until the forest. And so our quail are our edge birds. So if we can just create a little habitat there, we're going a long way. Here's other images of that same concept. This is a field corner. So any type of field that's irrigated, a lot of times that machine is going in circles. And so you'll have these corners that are left open. And so these are great areas to create habitat. The picture on the top right, we've got some wet areas in the bottom. So another thing we look for is if there's a low production site on the crop field, because maybe it was naturally a wetland, we'll help convert that back into a natural area. And again, it should not impact crop revenue too much because it was never that productive anyways. Prairie strips, these are more done in the Midwest, but probably also in Texas, where you know, instead of just having all ag throughout the field, they actually create these natural strips. And these are great corridors because, you know, birds are not going to be successful crossing any big fields. And so creating these strips of corridors will really improve their success. Same thing can be done on waterways. So the top right, that is a little creek bed or just a drainage of that field. And so they've let that go natural, and it's created that nice weedy field edge up until the crops. And then on the bottom right, this one's more of a pollinator plot, but same thing was done here on a field edge, and they just did a really good seeding of some pollinator plants there. Native warm season grasses are a big one that we push. Little blue stem there on top, switchgrass, Indian grass, those are all native. And with a big part of those native plants, as a lot of our master naturalists know, like the roots are so important, and the prairie grasses, the roots go deeper than the grasses grow tall. So that's very important for soil processes and soil erosion. And livestock can actually feed on a lot of these native grasses. So that's another educational piece that a lot of cattle ranchers may not be aware of. And they usually rely on their cool season grasses like their Bermuda and fescue. But those really don't grow that well into the warm season. So what we try to implement is some of both, you know, talk about that balance all the time, is have some fields of warm season grasses so that they can supplement during the summer to eat those areas. And we also talk about grazing. So there's different techniques with that. There's rotational grazing, where they will move from sections of the field and then block off other sections. There's continuous grazing, and that's going to be using those different types of grasses I just mentioned between the warm season and the cool season. So those grasses are going to naturally grow in their specific season, and the cattle will move there just naturally. So it reduces any need for cross fencing. And that same thought works with patch burn grazing. So if you've ever seen a prescribed burn, the grasses will grow, all the plants will grow very well after a burn. A lot of your turkey hunters will say, if you want to kill a turkey, go into a freshly burned plot, because they're going to be there feeding. So same kind of thing happens here is you can burn a section of the field. It's going to create that new growth. The cattle are going to move there naturally. So less need to use fencing or other ways of maneuvering the cattle throughout the landscape. I apologize if I'm missing any questions. I saw one pop up, but I can't see it anymore, so I might have to hold it till the end. Prescribed fire. So there's a lot of different times of the year you can burn. This is just a example for if you're burning in pasture, but where I am, we do a lot of forestry burnings as well. So most of your burns are going to happen in the winter, because that's going to reset that thatch, that dead material that's there, and that main goal too is to get rid of that material as fuel. So it's preventing wildfires from getting out by reducing that fuel load. Burning into February and March is going to be encouraging cool season grasses, versus if you burn later into the spring, April, May, it's going to encourage warm season grasses, which are your natives. But during that time is also quail nesting season, so you have to be careful of where you're burning and what your goals are there. This is just a quick snapshot of all the different resources you have in the Rio Grande Valley. So I mentioned the NRCS office, the Natural Resource Conservation Service within the USDA Center. In Cameron County, it looks like they have centers in San Benito, Edinburgh. Yeah, it looks like most of those are on the Edinburgh. So there's some different contacts there. Just wanted to show that everything that I've got going on where I am, the same type thing is going on in your county, other than there's not a Quail Forever biologist down there. Not yet. There's one in Laredo. So the other biologists in the area are mostly with your Texas Parks and Wildlife. So they're covering your Cameron County. And for the bobwhite quail, I couldn't really find a place to put this image, but the one image on the left is showing the scaled quail, bobwhite, and then the area in the middle is of yellow, Central Texas, more close to the west, but they have both types. So we're mostly working with bobwhite quail in South Texas. You all have a South Texas Quail Forever chapter in Karnes County. So again, that's pretty far. South Texas is huge. So there's not one in the Rio Grande Valley. So that whole area is open. If anyone was interested in creating a chapter, I can help navigate you through that. And this is the Texas Pheasants and Quail Forever map. So there is a couple Pheasants Forever chapters up in the Panhandle. And then so all the bird images are your chapters, and then some of the colors are showing where the different partner biologists are working out of. So the closest person to you all would be Nolan. He's based out of the Laredo region, but you can see what counties he covers. There's a lot of gaps here. In South Carolina, currently I'm covering 7 counties, and we've got most of them filled. So Texas is huge. It's got a lot more room to grow. Here's some of your USDA contacts. Oh wait, no, wrong. I just had a USDA background. Just kidding. These are more Quail Forever contacts. Basically, I'm just showing you there is somebody for you to talk to. If you're a landowner or know a landowner that may be interested, we can find the person for them. So how can you all get involved? So you might ask yourself, like, are you passionate about hunting and habitat? You know, what kind of differences do you want to make for your local wildlife? Here might be some other, in addition to all your master naturalist activities, membership is a big thing with any nonprofit. So there's different levels of membership. The affiliate membership with Quail Forever is only $35. Student membership is $25. So you may consider that, or volunteering with chapter activities. So I put the Lone Star Quail Forever page there. So that state chapter actually runs a website. And then the Bobscapes. So Bobscapes is a new app. It's very similar to iNaturalist. So if you hear or see any bobwhite quail in your area, or even, you know, if you're at one of the state parks doing some landscaping work as a master naturalist or whatever you have it, you know, feel free to download that app and just start keeping track of some different quail sightings you have. It's pretty simple to use, maybe takes a minute to fill out the questions. It does save the location that goes to the database, but none of the locations are available to the public. So if you're on private lands and you share something, you're not going to be sharing anything to other members of the public that should not have access to that. Another good app I like to use, some of you may be aware of it already, I just wanted to add it in here because it's really fun, is the Merlin app. So a lot of what I do for bird surveys now is all by ear. In South Carolina, everything is totally green and lots of trees, and you're not always going to see the bird. So that's been really interesting to me, learning by bird call, and it's nice to have that Merlin app. It will listen to bird sounds and it's pretty accurate. So it's a good way to double check yourself, or if you're hearing something you never heard before, that app will ID birds by sound. So that one's very fun. Oh, there we go. Somebody played it. So let me check the questions out, see what we've got. Let me just stop sharing. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or in person.
Shall we used to go? You can still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, it's more of advice rather than a question. I've been in the hunting business my whole life. I had a 15,000 acre ranch that I dearly loved. I did everything you just presented. I had over 2,000 acres of CRP land, over 1,500 acres of farmland. It was scattered. We, along with the oil and gas industry, putting Sanderas through it, we opened those up for more everything. In 1995, I got the ranch in 90. It took me 5 years, and the best quail I'd ever seen. You couldn't go 100 yards without bumping a covey all through the ranch. And I was more than excited, but I made the biggest mistake of my life. I bought an 18-wheeler load of corn to feed them. One thing I forgot to do, I didn't check the aflatoxin level on the corn.
Oh no.
I killed every quail on the ranch. And that's something that I wanted everybody to hear. When you supplemental feed, sometimes that's not good, because you need to check your aflatoxin level, mainly on corn, because I had milo, planted, of course, we also had deer. I had everything any animal could want. except when I dumped out and scattered the aflatoxin quail, because every animal has a limit on what of aflatoxin they can withstand. And to my knowledge, quail can stand hardly any.
Yeah, they're very sensitive.
And
You're not the only one. I hate that happened to you, but you're definitely not the only one.
It took 3 years for us to come back. And of course, after that, I always check the aflatoxin level on anything that you would, feed your wildlife. But everything you said just presented, we did. And through
Right.
biology help and things, and it works. It works. What you're doing is fantastic. I hope you can get it out to more ranchers to get that to work. But tell them, check your aflatoxin.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Anybody else?
Hi, this is Camille. I wanted to thank you for all this information. I am passionate about quail and I've been working on my little property for 5 years to keep the little toehold of like 8 or 9 that I see now and again going. And I was anticipating your presentation, so I downloaded the Bobscapes app and I've already put a few entries in on hearing. I do catch them on trail cam. And I have years of catching them on trail cam, but I'm not going to go back date, so to speak. But when I'm entering data on seeing and observing, I just didn't know if I was doing it correctly. I haven't, and I checked my spam. Will I get any type of email letting me know that my data is going in, or I just put it in and go with the protocols that are on the app?
Right. There is not, you don't get like a confirmation. It might say like as soon as you hit submit, like on the screen, it might say submitted. But there's no email or anything that comes after that. That is one of the things I don't like either, because you don't really know where your report went.
Right.
But one thing you can do is before you report it, you can click on Texas and it'll tell you like, there's 40 reports. And then I've noticed as soon as I plug mine in, it'll then say 41.
Oh, hey,
I
that's
click back on it.
That's very smart. I hadn't thought about that. And I was going to ask you too, so all the dots on the map on the app, that those are participating states, or where this app is recording data from those states? The large orange
right.
pins? Okay,
That's right.
awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Anybody else? So I have one more thing to share with you all, and it's been a little crazy time for me, and you guys know I love Texas so much. So I've got something else in the works. So what's next for me? It's not going to be completely different than what I'm doing now. It's very similar. It's building off of this private lands work. And I'm moving on to Coastal Bend and Bay's Estuaries program. I'm going to start in Corpus Christi in September as a migratory shorebird private lands project leader, and I'll be covering up to Victoria area where a lot of the big ranches are, and we're going to be creating habitat for not just shorebirds and not just quail, lots of species of birds. So it's very cool how this has been a stepping stone into this opportunity, and I can continue to work with private lands back in one of my favorite states, Texas. So won't be in the Rio Grande Valley, but I'll be pretty close, and I'll hopefully get to see some of you all soon.
Well, Shelby, that's great news. That's a great way to end. We'd definitely like to see you at least get closer to home.
Yes. Well, thank you all. I have to go back to see some of these comments here.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Enjoyed it.
Oh, you're welcome.
And again, I'll echo that as well, Shelby. Thank you for your time tonight, and so glad to hear that you're getting back into our neck of the woods. We'd love to see you down here. Let us know when you are.
Yes, I will. Thank you all. Can't wait to see you.
All right. Thank you, Shelby.